The storm didn't kill her, but the man who saved her might destroy everything she'd fought to protect. In the savage Arizona territory of 1882, Clara Whitlock had survived loss, grief, and a frontier that devoured the weak. She'd built her life on one unbreakable rule: trust no one. Then Elias Rourke tore through the wreckage of her collapsing cabin and pulled her from certain death, shattering every wall she'd raised. Now, trapped under his roof while her world rebuilds, Clara faces a danger far greater than any storm. A man who sees through her armor, and a truth she's spent years running from. Stay with us until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert didn't forgive mistakes. Elias Rourke had learned that lesson the hard way, carved it into his bones through years of sun-scorched days and nights so cold they could freeze a man's last breath in his throat. The Arizona Territory in 1882 was a proving ground, a merciless stretch of dust and stone that measured a person's worth in blood and sweat. Those who understood that survived. Those who didn't became nameless markers in forgotten graves, if they were lucky enough to get buried at all. He stood at the edge of his property, boots planted in cracked earth, watching the horizon shimmer in the late afternoon heat. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, ochre and amber, punctuated by the dark silhouettes of saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. His ranch, if you could call it that, consisted of a weathered cabin, a half-collapsed barn, and enough acreage to run a small herd of cattle that were more bone than beef. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd fought like hell to keep it. The wind kicked up, carrying with it the familiar scent of creosote and dust. Elias squinted against the glare, his hand instinctively moving to the worn handle of the Colt revolver at his hip. Out here, caution wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Raiders, drifters, men running from the law or running toward trouble, they all passed through these parts eventually. The smart ones kept moving. The stupid ones didn't. That's why the movement in the distance caught his attention. At first he thought it was a dust devil, one of those swirling columns of sand that danced across the flats on hot days. But as he watched, the shape resolved into something more substantial. A wagon. A single horse pulling it, moving slow and deliberate along the rough track that passed for a road. Elias felt his jaw tighten. Neighbors were rare out here, and he preferred it that way. The last thing he needed was some greenhorn settler stumbling onto the land next to his, full of foolish dreams about taming the desert. He'd seen it before. Families who arrived with hope shining in their eyes, only to pack up and leave within months, broken by the reality of frontier life. Or worse, they stayed and died here. The wagon drew closer, and Elias could make out more details now. It was old, the wooden sides weathered and patched. The horse looked tired but steady, the kind of animal that knew hard work. And driving the wagon, he blinked, uncertain at first. A woman. Alone. Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. A woman traveling solo through this godforsaken country? Either she was running from something terrible, or she was too ignorant to know the danger she was in. Neither option was good. He watched as the wagon turned onto the old Garrett property, the parcel of land that bordered his to the east. The place had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since Frank Garrett had put a bullet in his own head after losing his wife and son to cholera. The cabin was still standing, barely, but the land had gone fallow and wild. No one with any sense would try to claim it. The wagon stopped in front of the dilapidated cabin. The woman climbed down, moving with a deliberate efficiency that spoke of practice. She was tall, he noticed, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Even from this distance, there was something in the way she carried herself, a kind of rigid determination, like a blade that had been tempered in fire. She stood there for a long moment, surveying the wreckage of the Garrett place with what looked like grim assessment rather than dismay. Then she turned, and even across the 100 yards that separated them, Elias could feel the weight of her gaze. She'd seen him watching. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, two figures in a vast, empty landscape, measuring each other across the distance. Then she turned away, dismissing him as easily as swatting a fly, and began unloading supplies from her wagon. Elias felt an unfamiliar flicker of irritation. He'd expected fear, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. But this woman had looked at him like he was nothing more than part of the scenery, no more significant than a rock or a cactus. "Damn fool woman," he muttered under his breath, turning back toward his cabin. But even as he walked away, he couldn't quite shake the image of her from his mind. There was something about the set of her shoulders, the way she'd stood there alone against the vastness of the desert, that stirred something he'd thought long dead. Curiosity. And beneath that, something more dangerous. Concern. The next morning, Elias found himself drawn back to the edge of his property, coffee cup in hand, watching the Garrett place. He told himself it was simple vigilance, keeping an eye on a potential problem. But the truth gnawed at him, uncomfortable and insistent. The woman was already awake and working. He could see her moving around the cabin, and even from here he could tell she was tackling the impossible task of making the place habitable. The roof had more holes than solid planks. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The well had probably gone dry years ago. She'd be gone within a week, he told himself. 2 at most. But as the days passed, she didn't leave. Instead, she worked with a relentless determination that Elias found both admirable and infuriating. She patched the roof with scraps of wood and tar paper. She cleared the debris from inside the cabin, hauling out years of accumulated damage. Broken furniture, rotted fabric, the detritus of a family's destroyed dreams. She dug out the well, spending hours under the brutal sun, lowering herself into the dark shaft to clear the stones and sediment that had choked it. And she did it all alone. Elias found himself watching more than he intended. He told himself it was concern for his own property. If trouble came to the Garrett place, it would spill over onto his land soon enough. But that was a lie, and he knew it. There was something magnetic about her solitude. She moved through her tasks with a kind of fierce privacy, as if she'd built walls around herself that were even stronger than the ones she was trying to repair on the cabin. She never looked his way again, never acknowledged his presence, even though he knew she had to be aware of him. It was driving him crazy. "The hell's wrong with you?" he asked himself one evening, standing on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, staring across at the distant glow of her lamp through the cabin window. "She's just another drifter. None of your business." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Because women didn't drift through the Arizona territory alone, not unless they had damned good reasons. And those reasons were usually the kind that brought trouble riding close behind. 3 days later, he saw the riders. There were 4 of them, moving along the same rough track that the woman had used. They rode with the lazy confidence of men who knew they were the biggest predators in the territory, outlaws most likely, or ranch hands gone bad. The distinction didn't matter much out here. Elias felt his blood go cold as he watched them turn toward the Garrett property. He was moving before he'd made a conscious decision, grabbing his rifle from inside the cabin and striding across the scrubland that separated his land from hers. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and the afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders like a hammer. By the time he got close enough to hear, the riders had already cornered her. "Now what's a fine-looking woman like you doing out here all alone?" The voice was rough, mocking, thick with implication. Elias approached from an angle that gave him cover behind a large boulder. From there, he could see the scene clearly. The 4 men had dismounted, forming a loose semicircle around the woman. She stood in front of her cabin door, one hand resting on the frame, the other hidden behind her back. Her face was composed, almost eerily calm, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders. "Passing through," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I'd appreciate if you did the same." The leader of the group, a scarred man with a tobacco-stained beard, laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "You hear that, boys? She'd appreciate it." He took a step closer. "Thing is, we've been riding a long time. Thought we might stay for a spell. Maybe you could offer us some hospitality." "I have nothing to offer you." Her voice didn't waver. "Leave. Now." "Or what?" Another one of the men stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "You gonna make us, sweetheart?" The woman's hidden hand came out from behind her back, and Elias saw the glint of steel. A small derringer, the kind women carried for close quarters protection. It was barely more than a toy compared to the weapons the men were carrying, but she held it steady, aimed directly at the leader's chest. "I said leave." The leader's smile vanished. His eyes went flat and cold. "You just made a mistake, woman." Elias stepped out from behind the boulder, the metallic click of his rifle's hammer echoing across the silence. "She's not alone." 4 heads turned toward him. The woman's eyes widened fractionally, the first crack in her composed facade he'd seen. Elias kept his rifle level, his voice steady and hard. "You boys are trespassing and threatening my neighbor. I suggest you mount up and ride on before this gets unpleasant." The leader's gaze shifted between Elias and the woman, calculating odds. 4 against 2, but the element of surprise was gone. And Elias stood with the practiced ease of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Didn't know she had a man," the leader said finally, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Now you do." Elias took another step forward. "So move along." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air like the charge before lightning strikes. Then the leader jerked his head toward his men. "Come on, plenty of other places." They mounted slowly, making a show of their contempt, but they mounted nonetheless. Within minutes, they were nothing but dust on the horizon. Elias lowered his rifle, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he turned to the woman, he expected gratitude, maybe even relief. What he got was fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice cracked across the space between them like a whip. The derringer was still in her hand, and for a moment, Elias wondered if she was going to turn it on him. "Saving your life, apparently," he said, his own irritation rising. "You're welcome. I didn't ask for your help." She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing. "I had the situation under control." "Under control?" Elias gestured toward the empty horizon where the riders had disappeared. "Lady, you had a pocket pistol against 4 armed men. That's not control. That's suicide. That's none of your concern." Her voice was ice now, each word carefully measured. "I don't need a protector. I don't need a neighbor watching over me like I'm some helpless child. I came here to be left alone. So leave. Me. Alone." The words hit harder than they should have. Elias felt his jaw clench, anger and something else, wounded pride maybe, warring in his chest. "Fine," he said flatly. "Next time you're about to get yourself killed, I'll just watch." "That what you want?" "What I want," she said, and her voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous, "is for you to understand that I didn't survive everything I've survived by depending on men to save me. I've made my way this far on my own, and I'll keep doing it. I don't owe you gratitude. I don't owe you anything." She turned and walked into her cabin, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the weakened frame. Elias stood there, rifle hanging loose in his hand, staring at the closed door. A dozen responses fought for voice in his throat, but none of them made it past his lips. Finally, he turned and walked back toward his own property, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. But even as anger simmered in his blood, another part of his mind was working, replaying the encounter. The way she'd held that derringer, steady, unflinching. The way she'd faced down 4 armed men without a tremor in her voice. The way she'd dismissed his help not out of foolishness, but out of something fiercer and more complicated. Pride. Independence. Survival instincts honed to a razor's edge. Whatever had driven her to this godforsaken piece of land, whatever she was running from or trying to forget, it had forged her into something harder than the desert itself. And despite the anger, despite the dismissal, despite every rational thought telling him to leave well enough alone, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The days that followed were exercises in mutual avoidance. Elias went about his work, tending his small herd, repairing fences, hauling water, with deliberate focus, forcing himself not to look toward the Garrett property. But awareness of her presence pulled at the edge of his consciousness like a persistent ache. He'd see smoke rising from her chimney in the mornings. He'd hear the distant sound of her hammering repairs late into the evening. Once, he caught a glimpse of her hauling water from the well, her movements efficient despite the obvious strain. She never looked his way, never acknowledged him. It was as if he'd ceased to exist in her world. It should have been a relief. It should have made things easier. It didn't. The problem was the silence. Out here, silence was the default, vast, empty stretches of nothing but wind and the occasional cry of a hawk. Elias had lived in that silence for years, had grown comfortable with it, even preferred it to the noise and chaos of civilization. But now the silence felt different, loaded. It pressed against him with questions he couldn't answer and thoughts he couldn't quiet. Who was she? What was she running from? And why the hell did he care? He was mucking out the barn, sweating through his shirt despite the early morning coolness, when he heard the wagon. For a moment, hope flared, irrational and unwelcome, that she was leaving, that this whole complicated situation would resolve itself through simple departure. But the wagon was heading into town, not away from it. He watched as she drove past, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She didn't so much as glance in his direction. Elias stabbed the pitchfork into the hay with more force than necessary. "Good riddance," he muttered, but his eyes tracked the wagon until it disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. She returned late in the afternoon, the wagon bed loaded with supplies, lumber, nails, bags of what looked like grain and flour. Elias was working on his fence line, close enough to see, but not so close that it would look like he was watching. He was definitely watching. She unloaded the wagon with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else, carrying heavy boards that should have required 2 people to manage. She worked until the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. When she finally stopped, she stood for a moment with her hands on her hips, surveying the cabin. Even from this distance, Elias could see the weariness in the slope of her shoulders. Then she straightened as if catching herself in a moment of weakness and disappeared inside. The lamp in her window flickered to life a few minutes later. Elias turned back to his own cabin, unsettled in ways he couldn't name. The storm caught everyone by surprise. Desert storms were unpredictable by nature. They could brew up out of nothing, unleashing fury before dissipating just as quickly. But this one was different. Elias felt it building all day, a pressure in the air that made his skin prickle and his cattle restless. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly green-gray, and the wind had picked up to a howl that drove dust and small stones against the cabin walls like buckshot. Elias secured everything he could, brought the cattle into the lee of the barn, shuttered the windows, made sure his supplies were protected. Then he looked toward the Garrett property. The cabin there was barely holding together on a good day. In a storm like this, "Not your problem," he told himself, even as he grabbed his rain slicker and headed for the door. "She made it damn clear she doesn't want your help." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Whatever pride or anger stood between them didn't matter if she died because he'd been too stubborn to check on her. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet the moment he stepped outside. Rain had started to fall, not in drops, but in sheets, cold and driving. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark, flickering snapshots. He fought his way across the scrubland, each step a battle against the wind. His boots sank into earth that was already turning to mud. The rain soaked through his slicker within seconds, plastering his clothes to his skin. Through the downpour, he could see the cabin, or what was left of it. The roof was coming apart, whole sections peeling away in the wind like paper. He could see movement inside, the woman trying desperately to salvage what she could as rain poured through the growing gaps. Then, with a crack that cut through even the storm's roar, one of the main support beams gave way. Elias ran. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He crashed through the weakened door just as the roof began its full collapse. The woman looked up, shock and fury warring on her face as she saw him. "Get out!" he shouted over the chaos. "My supplies! Now!" Another beam cracked. The whole structure was coming down, and they had seconds at best. Elias grabbed her arm, and she pulled against him, trying to reach for a bag of flour, a bundle of blankets, anything she could save. He yanked her back hard enough to make her stumble, then half carried, half dragged her toward the door. They made it through just as the main beam crashed down where she'd been standing moments before. The rain assaulted them immediately, but at least they were out from under the collapsing building. Elias didn't stop, didn't give her a chance to pull away. He kept moving, supporting her weight as they fought through the storm toward his cabin. She was shouting something, but the wind tore the words away. He could feel her struggling against his grip, could sense the fury radiating from her even through the chaos. They reached his cabin, and he shoved the door open, practically pushing her inside before following and slamming it shut against the storm. In the sudden relative quiet, they stood dripping on his floor, breathing hard. Rain drummed on the roof above them, solid, secure, holding. The woman turned on him, her face a mask of rage and something else he couldn't quite identify. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks, or maybe it was just rain. Her dark hair had come loose from its severe arrangement, hanging in wet tangles around her face. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking. "No right. You'd be dead." Elias cut her off, his own anger finally breaking through. That roof was coming down. Another 10 seconds and you'd have been buried under it. My supplies, everything Her voice cracked. Everything can be replaced. You can't. She stared at him, chest heaving, and for a moment he thought she might actually hit him. Then something seemed to break inside her. The fury drained away, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it was almost physical. She sank down onto the nearest chair, and a sound escaped her throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Bitter and broken and utterly defeated. Gone, she whispered. All of it, again. Elias stood there, dripping, uncertain. He'd never been good with tears, had learned to avoid situations that might produce them. But standing here, watching this fierce, proud woman crumble under the weight of loss, he felt something crack in his own carefully maintained armor. You're alive, he said quietly. That's what matters. She laughed again, that same bitter sound. Is it? She looked up at him, and her eyes were hollow. You don't understand. That cabin, those supplies, it took me everything I had to get here. Everything. And now, she trailed off, looking away. Elias moved slowly, grabbing a blanket from his chest and holding it out to her. You're soaked. You'll catch pneumonia. She stared at the blanket like it was a snake, then finally took it, wrapping it around her shoulders with mechanical movements. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension settled. They were trapped here together, two strangers forced into proximity by necessity, with nowhere to hide from each other. Elias busied himself lighting the stove, stoking the fire to chase away the chill that had seeped into the room. He could feel her watching him, could sense the walls she was trying to rebuild, even as they crumbled around her. I don't even know your name, he said finally, not looking at her. Silence stretched between them. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. Clara Whitlock. He turned, meeting her eyes. Elias Rourke. She nodded, a tiny acknowledgement. Then she looked down at her hands, pale and trembling in her lap. I had a husband, she said abruptly. Thomas. We came west 3 years ago, Nebraska. We were going to build something together, a ranch, a life. Elias stayed quiet, sensing that she needed to speak more than she needed a response. He died 6 months after we arrived. Cholera. Her voice was flat now, emotionless. I buried him alone. Sold what we had, kept moving. Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico. Everywhere I went, men... She stopped, swallowing hard. Men who thought a widow was easy prey, or easy comfort, or easy to control. So you came here, Elias said softly. To be alone. To be free. She looked up at him, and the intensity in her gaze was almost painful. Do you understand? Not to be anyone's wife, anyone's problem, anyone's responsibility, just mine. To succeed or fail on my own terms. And I ruined that. It wasn't a question. You saved my life. The word sounded like an accusation, which means now I owe you, and I swore I would never owe anyone anything ever again. Elias felt the weight of that statement, understood the layers of pain and survival beneath it. He crossed to the window, looking out at the storm that showed no signs of abating. You don't owe me anything, he said finally. What I did out there, that wasn't about keeping score, that was... He struggled for the words. I couldn't watch someone die. Not if I could prevent it, that's all. Is it? Her voice was sharp again. Or did you do it because you thought I couldn't handle it myself? Because you looked at me and saw someone who needed saving? He turned to face her. I looked at you and saw someone in danger, same as I'd do for anyone. Liar. The word hung between them, cutting and accurate. Because she was right, it wasn't the same. If it had been anyone else, any other drifter or settler, he probably would have stayed on his own property and let the storm do its work. But it had been her, and that made all the difference, even if he couldn't explain why. Fine, he said. You want the truth? I watched you for days, working yourself to the bone trying to rebuild that wreck of a cabin. I watched you do the work of 3 men alone, without asking for help, without even acknowledging that I existed. And yeah, part of me thought you were being stubborn and foolish, but another part... He stopped, running a hand through his wet hair. Another part saw someone fighting like hell to survive, and I respected that. So when I saw the storm coming, saw that cabin falling apart, I couldn't just stand by. Call it whatever you want, but that's the truth. Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, echoing like artillery fire. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally, her voice small, vulnerable in a way that seemed to cost her. "Accept help. Trust someone. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. "I can't afford to depend on anyone, because everyone I've ever depended on has either died or disappointed me, and I can't go through that again." Elias nodded slowly, understanding settling in his bones. "Then don't depend on me. Stay here until the storm passes, until you figure out your next move. But don't call it dependence. Call it," he searched for the right word, "neighboring. Out here, neighbors help each other through the hard times. It's not about owing, it's just about surviving." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Deception, pity, ulterior motives. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. "Neighboring," she repeated, testing the word. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "All right, until the storm passes." It was the smallest of concessions, the thinnest thread of truce, but it was something. Elias turned back to the stove, busying himself with putting coffee on to boil. Behind him, he heard Clara shift in her chair, heard the quiet rustle of the blanket. The storm raged on outside, but inside, in the warm circle of firelight, two wounded souls had taken the first tentative step toward something neither of them could name yet. And in the darkness beyond the windows, the Arizona frontier watched and waited, patient as stone, ready to test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. The night was just beginning. The coffee boiled over before Elias noticed, hissing against the hot stove and filling the cabin with the acrid smell of burnt grounds. He cursed under his breath, grabbing a cloth to pull the pot away from the heat. Behind him, he heard Clara shift in her chair, but she said nothing. The silence between them had weight now, different from the hostile distance of the past week. This silence was close, compressed by the cabin's walls and the storm's fury outside. It demanded something neither of them seemed ready to give. Elias poured 2 cups of the salvaged coffee, the liquid dark and bitter. He handed one to Clara without meeting her eyes, then retreated to the opposite side of the room, leaning against the wall near the window. Rain streaked down the glass in rivulets, distorting the darkness beyond into abstract patterns. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, seeking warmth. Her wet clothes clung to her frame, and even in the firelight, Elias could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. Shock, cold, exhaustion, probably all 3. "There's dry clothes in the chest," he said, gesturing with his cup. "They'll be too big, but better than freezing." She looked at the chest, then back at him, her jaw set. "I'm fine." "You're shaking." "I said I'm fine." Elias bit back his response, forcing himself to stay quiet. This woman could be stubborn as a mule, and pushing her would only make things worse. He'd learned that much already. But as the minutes ticked by and her shivering intensified, Clara finally stood with obvious reluctance. She set down her coffee cup and crossed to the chest, opening it to reveal his spare clothes. Rough cotton shirts, wool pants, extra socks. All worn soft from use, all smelling faintly of soap and sage. She pulled out a shirt and pants, then glanced at him expectantly. Elias turned to face the window, giving her privacy. He heard the rustle of wet fabric being peeled away, the quiet sounds of her changing. It felt oddly intimate, standing there in the small cabin while she shed her soaked clothes just a few feet away. He focused on the storm, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, trying not to think about the woman behind him. "You can turn around." He did. The clothes swallowed her, the shirt hung past her hips, the pants rolled several times at the ankles. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she had in her own severe, practical clothing. Her hair was still wet, hanging loose past her shoulders in dark waves. "Better?" he asked. "Warmer," she conceded, which was as close to gratitude as she seemed willing to get. She returned to her chair, pulling the blanket back around herself despite the dry clothes. Elias watched her settle in, noticed the way her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the darkness where her cabin and everything she owned was being destroyed by wind and rain. How long do these storms usually last? She asked quietly. Hard to say. Could blow through in an hour. Could last all night. He paused. Morning at the latest. She nodded, absorbing this information with the same stoic acceptance she seemed to bring to everything. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the blanket a little too tightly. The supplies you lost, Elias said, choosing his words carefully. What did you have? Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, and he could see her weighing whether to answer. Finally, she said, lumber, nails, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, coffee. She listed the items mechanically, as if reading from a ledger. 2 blankets, a cookpot, some basic tools I'd managed to scavenge. Any money left? Her silence was answer enough. Elias set down his coffee cup and crossed to his own supply shelf. He pulled down a pad of paper and a pencil, started making a list. Clara watched him with growing wariness. What are you doing? Making an inventory. You'll need to replace what you lost, and I don't need your charity. The words came out sharp, cutting. It's not charity. It's practicality. He kept writing. The general store in town extends credit. I don't take credit. I don't take loans. I don't owe anyone. Clara stood abruptly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. I told you I won't be indebted. Not to you, not to anyone. Then what's your plan? Elias asked, his own frustration rising. You've got no supplies, no shelter, and by your own admission, no money. What exactly do you intend to do? Walk away from the land you just bought? Start over somewhere else with empty pockets? If I have to. That's not surviving, that's running. The words hit their mark. Clara's face flushed, her eyes flashing with anger. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've survived or how I did it. Don't you dare presume to tell me what I am or am not doing. I know stubbornness when I see it, Elias shot back. And I know the difference between independence and suicide. There's no shame in accepting help when you need it, says the man who lives alone in the middle of nowhere, who probably hasn't had a conversation longer than 5 minutes in months. Her voice was acid now. Tell me, Elias Rourke, when was the last time you accepted help from anyone? The question struck deeper than she could have known. Elias felt his jaw clench, old memories rising like ghosts. She was right, of course. He'd built his isolation deliberately, brick by brick, until he'd created a fortress that kept everyone out. That's different, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Is it? Or are you just as afraid of connection as I am? Clara took a step toward him, and there was something almost predatory in her gaze now. You sit in your cabin and watch the world from a distance. You don't go to town unless you have to. You don't have friends, don't have family visiting. You're alone by choice, same as me. So don't act like you're offering help out of some noble neighborly impulse. You're just as broken as I am. The truth of it hit like a physical blow. Elias stood there, the paper and pencil forgotten in his hands, staring at this woman who'd somehow seen through him in a matter of minutes. You're right, he said finally, his voice low. I am broken. This land, this life, it's what I chose after everything else fell apart. I don't let people in because I learned the hard way that people leave. They die, or they betray you, or they just disappear. So yeah, I'm alone, but at least I'm honest about it. Clara's expression shifted, the anger draining away to reveal something more complex. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. What happened to you? She asked, her voice gentler now. Elias turned away, moving back to the window. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes, revealing a world transformed by water and wind. I had a wife once, he said, the words coming slowly, painfully. Sarah. We came out here together, young and stupid and full of dreams. We were going to build an empire, raise a family, prove everyone back east wrong about the frontier. He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. She died in childbirth, the baby too, son. I buried them both on that hill behind the cabin. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with shared grief. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. After that, I just stopped. Stopped trying to build anything beyond basic survival. Stopped talking to people in town beyond what was necessary. The land became enough. Had to be enough. because everything else hurt too much. He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he let her see the pain he usually kept locked away. So you're right, I am broken. But maybe that's why I recognize the same thing in you. Takes one to know one, I guess. Clara stood very still, her arms wrapped around herself. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas died because I couldn't save him. I watched the cholera take him over 3 days, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. And after he was gone, after I'd buried him and sold everything we'd built together, I swore I would never put myself in that position again. Never care enough to be destroyed by loss. But you're still here, Elias said, still fighting to build something. If you'd really given up, you'd have stayed in one of those towns, found some safe, miserable existence. Instead, you came to one of the hardest places in the territory and tried to carve out a life. Maybe I'm just stubborn. Or maybe you're not as done with living as you think you are. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them, a recognition of kindred damage, of parallel scars. Two people who'd been broken by this land and yet couldn't seem to leave it. The moment stretched, fragile and unexpected. Then Clara broke it, looking away. The storm's not letting up. No, Elias agreed. You'll have to stay here tonight. Tomorrow we can assess the damage, figure out what's salvageable. He expected another argument, another assertion of independence. But Clara simply nodded, exhaustion finally winning out over pride. Thank you, she said, and the words sounded like they cost her. You can take the bed, Elias said, gesturing to the corner where a simple frame held a straw mattress. I'll sleep by the fire. That's your bed. And you're soaked through and half frozen. Don't argue. This isn't charity, it's common sense. For a moment he thought she might fight him on it, but then she simply nodded again, moving toward the bed with the careful steps of someone running on the last reserves of their strength. Elias busied himself arranging blankets near the fire, trying not to watch as Clara settled onto the mattress. He heard the creak of the frame, the rustle of covers, then silence. He stoked the fire, adding enough wood to keep it burning through the night. The warmth pushed back against the chill that seeped through the walls, creating a small pocket of comfort in the midst of the storm's chaos. When he finally allowed himself to look, Clara had turned to face the wall, the blanket pulled up to her shoulders. He couldn't tell if she was asleep or just pretending to be, seeking the privacy of darkness. Elias settled by the fire, his back against the wall, rifle within easy reach out of habit. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin held firm. Solid walls, a secure roof, the work of his own hands over years of careful maintenance. He'd built this place as a fortress against the world. And now, for the first time since Sarah's death, someone else occupied it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sleep came in fits and starts, his mind too active to fully rest. He dozed in the chair, waking periodically to check the fire or listen to the storm's progress. Each time he woke, he found himself glancing toward the bed, making sure Clara was still there, still breathing, still real. It had been so long since another person had been in this space, so long since he'd heard someone else's breath, sensed another presence in the darkness. It should have felt intrusive, uncomfortable. Instead, it felt almost right. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Elias woke to the sound of movement. Clara was sitting up in bed, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the dying fire. She had her arms wrapped around her knees, and even from across the room, he could sense her distress. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. She startled slightly, not realizing he'd been awake. "I keep thinking about the cabin. Everything I worked for, just gone." Elias stood, moving to add wood to the fire. The flames caught, pushing back the darkness. "It's not all gone. The land's still there. Some of the structure might be salvageable, and you still have your wagon and horse." "It's not enough," her voice cracked. "I spent everything I had on that land, traveled 800 miles to get here, and now you start over, same as you've done before." "I'm tired of starting over," Clara said, and the raw honesty in her voice cut straight through him. "I'm so damn tired of fighting and losing and fighting again. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just stop." Elias moved to sit on the floor near the bed, far enough to give her space, but close enough to talk without raising his voice. "I know that feeling. After Sarah died, I spent months waiting for the land to kill me. Took stupid risks, didn't bother with precautions. Part of me wanted it to end. What changed? He thought about it, trying to find words for something he'd never really examined. I guess I realized that dying was easy. Living was the real challenge, and I'd be damned if I'd let this godforsaken territory win. Clara laughed, a soft, bitter sound. Spite. You survived out of spite. Is there a better reason? No, she admitted. I suppose there isn't. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the storm had begun to ease, the wind less violent, the rain settling into a steady rhythm rather than a battering assault. Can I ask you something? Clara said eventually. Sure. Well, why did you really come after me tonight? And don't say it's what anyone would do. I know that's not true. Elias stared into the fire, watching the flames dance across the logs. He could give her the easy answer, the one that would maintain the careful distance they both seemed to need, or he could give her the truth. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe because watching you work yourself to the bone reminded me what it was like to have purpose. Maybe because you're the first person in years who looked at me and didn't see a ghost. Or maybe, he paused, struggling with the words, maybe because I recognized something in you that I thought I'd lost in myself. The will to fight, even when fighting seems pointless. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I thought I wanted to be completely alone. No connections, no obligations, no one to disappoint or lose. But tonight, when that roof started coming down and you pulled me out, I realized how lonely I've actually been. Lonely and alone aren't the same thing, Elias said. No, but I've been both for so long I forgot the difference. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Elias felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands he'd kept wrapped around himself for years. The offer stands, he said carefully, for the supplies, the help rebuilding, not as charity or debt, but as neighboring, Clara finished. A small smile touched her lips. I'm starting to understand what that means. It means you don't have to do everything alone. It means accepting that sometimes survival requires swallowing your pride and letting someone give a damn about whether you live or die. And what do you get out of it? She asked, her eyes sharp even in the dim light. Why help someone you barely know? Elias considered this, knowing she deserved an honest answer. Maybe because helping you means I'm not just existing anymore. Maybe because, for the first time in 3 years, I feel like something matters beyond just getting through another day. The vulnerability of the statement hung in the air between them. Clara studied his face, and he let her, refusing to hide behind the walls he usually kept firmly in place. All right, she said finally. We'll try it, neighboring, but I pay back what I owe, one way or another. No free rides. I wouldn't expect anything less. A ghost of a smile crossed her face, quickly suppressed, but there nonetheless. You're going to regret this. I'm difficult to get along with. I noticed. Stubborn, clearly. And I have no patience for fools. Lucky for both of us, then, that I'm not one. Clara laughed. A real laugh this time, brief but genuine. The sound of it did something strange to Elias's chest, like a muscle that had been clenched for too long finally releasing. Get some sleep, he said, standing. Morning's going to come whether we're ready or not. Elias? Her voice stopped him as he moved back toward the fire. Thank you, for tonight, for not letting me die out of stubbornness. You're welcome. He settled back by the fire, wrapping himself in a blanket and listening as Clara lay back down. The storm outside had diminished to a gentle rain now, the fury spent. By morning it would be over, leaving behind a washed landscape and the wreckage of what had been. But also, Elias thought, as sleep finally claimed him, the possibility of something new. The morning came gray and damp, the world outside the cabin transformed. Elias woke first, his body protesting the night spent in a chair. He stretched carefully, working out the kinks in his back, and checked the fire. Nearly dead, just embers. He added wood, coaxing it back to life. Clara still slept, curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek. In sleep, the hard edges that defined her softened, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Elias turned away quickly, feeling like he'd intruded on something private. He moved quietly, starting coffee and checking his supplies. They had enough food for a few days, enough to share without either of them going hungry. It was a start. By the time the coffee was ready, Clara had woken. She sat up slowly, disoriented for a moment before memory seemed to return. She looked at the dry clothes she wore, at Elias by the stove, and something complicated crossed her face. "Morning," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "Morning." She took the cup, wrapping her hands around it. "The storm?" "Passed. Rain stopped about an hour ago." She nodded, steeling herself for what came next. "I should go look at the damage." "We'll both go. After you eat something." Elias expected an argument, but Clara simply nodded. Maybe the events of the previous night had shifted something between them, created a fragile truce that neither wanted to break yet. He put together a simple breakfast. Fried cornmeal mush, the last of some bacon he'd been saving. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence now. Companionable, almost. When they finished, Clara changed back into her own clothes, now dry but stiff from the mud and rain. She looked more like herself again, that armor of independence settling back into place. But something remained different, a crack in the facade that hadn't been there before. They walked across the scrubland together, boots squelching in the mud. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, sending shafts of pale light across the transformed landscape. Water stood in puddles everywhere, and the air smelled clean, washed free of dust. The garret cabin was worse than Elias had feared. The roof had collapsed completely, beams and planks scattered like kindling. One wall had buckled, leaning dangerously inward. The door hung by a single hinge. Inside, everything was soaked, destroyed, or buried under debris. Clara stood at the edge of the destruction, her face carefully blank. But Elias could see her hands clenched into fists at her sides, could sense the effort it took to maintain that composure. "Well," she said finally, her voice steady. "That's that." "Some of the lumber might be salvageable," Elias offered, "and the wagon's intact. Your horse weathered it fine in my barn." She nodded mechanically, still staring at the wreckage. Then she turned away abruptly, walking toward the small rise behind the cabin. Elias followed at a distance, giving her space but not leaving her alone. Clara stopped at the top of the rise, looking out across the empty land. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. "I was so sure this time," she said quietly. "So certain I could do it alone, make it work through sheer will. But the land doesn't care about determination, does it?" "No," Elias admitted. "It doesn't. Then how do people survive out here? How did you?" He came to stand beside her, following her gaze across the landscape. "By understanding that the land wins every fight. Always. So you don't fight it, you adapt. You bend instead of breaking, and you accept that some battles require reinforcements." Clara looked at him sidelong. "Is this the part where you tell me I need you? This is the part where I tell you the truth. One person alone out here is vulnerable. Two people working together have better odds. It's mathematics, not romance." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Mathematics. That's one way to put it." "I'm not asking you to depend on me," Elias continued. "I'm suggesting a partnership. You've got land, I've got resources and experience. We pool what we have, rebuild your cabin properly this time, help each other survive. When you're stable and established, we reassess. And what do you get out of this partnership?" He considered lying, making it purely transactional. But something about the morning light and the devastation behind them made honesty feel essential. "Company," he said simply. "Someone to talk to besides cattle. Someone who understands what it takes to survive out here. And maybe," he paused, then pushed forward, "maybe the chance to feel useful again, to build something that matters." Clara studied his face, searching for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "All right, a partnership. But we set clear terms. I work for what I receive. No charity, no debt." "Agreed. And if at any point it's not working, either of us can walk away." "Fair enough." She extended her hand and Elias took it. Her grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who knew hard work. They shook once, sealing the agreement. "So," Clara said, releasing his hand and turning back toward the destroyed cabin, "where do we start?" Elias surveyed the wreckage with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen his share of destruction. "First, we salvage what we can. Any lumber that's not split or rotted goes into a pile. Same with nails. We'll need every one we can find. Clara nodded, already moving toward the collapsed structure. She worked without hesitation, pulling at broken boards, testing their integrity with quick, efficient movements. Elias joined her, and together they began the slow process of sorting through the debris. The work was hard, physical, requiring strength and endurance. Mud sucked at their boots with each step. Splinters drove into their hands despite their calluses. The sun climbed higher, burning off the clouds and turning the damp air into a sauna that made breathing feel like drinking soup. But Clara never complained, never slowed. She matched Elias board for board, nail for nail, her jaw set with determination. When a particularly heavy beam proved too much for one person, she didn't ask for help. She just waited until he noticed and came to assist, the two of them lifting in synchronized silence. By midday, they'd created 3 piles: salvageable lumber, damaged but potentially usable materials, and complete losses. The third pile was depressingly large. "We'll need to make a trip to town," Elias said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There's not enough here to rebuild properly. I told you I don't have money for supplies. But I do. And before you argue," he held up a hand, "this is an investment in the partnership. Can't have my neighbor living in a lean-to. Bad for both our property values." Clara's eyes narrowed, but he could see her weighing practicality against pride. Finally, she said, "I'll pay you back. With work, if not cash. I can hunt. I can help with your herd. We'll figure it out." Elias cut her off gently. "For now, let's focus on getting you 4 walls and a roof." They broke for a meal, dried meat and hardtack that Elias had brought from his cabin, washed down with water from his canteen. They sat in the shade of Clara's wagon, the only structure that had survived the storm intact. "Tell me about town," Clara said, biting into the hardtack with more force than necessary. "I only passed through once to file the land claim." "Not much to tell. General store, saloon, sheriff's office, maybe 200 souls if you count the surrounding homesteads." Elias stretched his legs out, feeling the ache in his muscles. "Folks mostly keep to themselves, but they gossip like it's a competitive sport. Word of a single woman homesteading alone will already be making the rounds. Let them talk. They will, but they'll also make assumptions. About you, about us, about why you're here." He paused. "Might be easier if they think we're working together. Partnership, like we said. Less scandalous than you being alone." Clara's expression hardened. "I don't care what they think." "Maybe you should. Out here, reputation matters. It's the difference between people helping you in a crisis and people deciding you're not worth the trouble." "I've never been worth the trouble to anyone." The bitterness in her voice made Elias look at her more closely. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" She met his gaze, and there was a challenge in her eyes. "You think I don't know what people see when they look at me? A widow who couldn't keep her husband alive. A woman too stubborn to remarry and accept her proper place. Someone who's running from something, probably her own failures." "That's what they see because they don't know you," Elias said quietly. "But I'm starting to. And what I see is someone who survived hell and came out fighting. That's not failure. That's strength." Clara looked away, but not before he saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of something softer that she quickly shut down. "We should get back to work," she said, standing and brushing dust from her borrowed pants. "Daylight's burning." They worked through the afternoon, the heat intensifying until the air shimmered and sweat soaked through their clothes. Elias found himself watching Clara when she wasn't looking, noticing things he'd missed before. The way she moved with economic precision, no wasted motion. The set of her jaw when she encountered a particularly stubborn nail. The brief moments when exhaustion would show in the slope of her shoulders before she'd straighten again, refusing to yield. She was beautiful, he realized. Not in the soft, delicate way that society prized, but in the way a cliff face was beautiful. All hard lines and uncompromising angles, shaped by wind and time into something elemental. The thought unsettled him. He hadn't allowed himself to notice a woman that way since Sarah's death, had locked that part of himself away so thoroughly he'd almost forgotten it existed. "You planning to stare all day or actually help?" Clara's voice snapped him back to the present. She was looking at him with one eyebrow raised, a hint of amusement in her expression. "Sorry, lost in thought." "Must have been some thought. You've been holding that same board for 5 minutes." Elias looked down at the plank in his hands, feeling heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the sun. Just trying to figure the best use for it. Uh-huh. Clara's tone suggested she didn't believe him, but she let it go. Well, when you're done contemplating that particular piece of wood, I could use help with the corner post. It's heavier than it looks. They worked together to free the post from the rubble, their hands occasionally brushing as they maneuvered it into place. Each contact sent an unexpected jolt through Elias, and from the way Clara would pull back just a fraction too quickly, he suspected she felt it too. By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they'd cleared most of the debris and salvaged everything useful. It wasn't much, maybe a quarter of what would be needed for a proper cabin, but it was a start. I'll hitch up the wagon in the morning, Elias said as they surveyed their work. Town's about 4 hours each way. We can load up on supplies, be back by evening. We? You think I'm letting you go alone after what happened with those riders? Clara's expression darkened. I can handle myself. I know you can, but there's no sense taking unnecessary risks. Besides, he added with a slight smile, someone needs to help you load all that lumber. She studied him for a moment, then surprised him by laughing, a short, rueful sound. You're not going to make this partnership easy, are you? Would you respect me if I did? Probably not. She started toward the wagon to retrieve her horse. All right, we go together, but I'm driving my own wagon. Wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. They walked back to Elias's cabin in the gathering dusk, the air finally beginning to cool. The storm had left the desert washed clean, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. It's beautiful, Clara said quietly, pausing to watch the light show. The land, I mean. Even when it's trying to kill you, it's beautiful. That's the trap, Elias replied. It gives you moments like this, makes you think you can survive anything. Then it tears you apart just when you've let your guard down. Sounds like you're speaking from experience. We all are out here. Everyone who's lasted more than a year has scars to prove it. Clara touched her chest briefly, an unconscious gesture that spoke of wounds deeper than anything the land could inflict. Not all scars are visible. No, Elias agreed. They're not. At the cabin, they fell into an easy routine that surprised them both. Clara retrieved items from her wagon while Elias prepared a simple dinner, beans and salt pork, cornbread baked in a Dutch oven. They ate sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Where will I sleep? Clara asked eventually, the practical question breaking the comfortable silence. Elias had been wrestling with this all day. You can take the bed again. No. Clara set down her plate with finality. I won't keep displacing you from your own bed. I can sleep in the barn, or the barn's full of cattle and has more holes than walls. You'll freeze. Then I'll sleep by the fire again. It's warm enough. They stared at each other, both stubborn, both refusing to yield. Finally, Elias sighed. We'll trade off. You take the bed tonight, I take it tomorrow. Fair? Only if you actually use it tomorrow and don't try some noble nonsense about giving it back to me. Deal. Clara extended her hand, and they shook on it. The second agreement they'd sealed that way in as many days. But this handshake lasted a fraction longer than necessary, their palms pressed together in the darkness, and when they finally let go, Elias could still feel the warmth of her skin against his. That night, lying by the fire while Clara slept in his bed, Elias found his mind racing. The cabin felt different with her in it. Smaller somehow, but also more complete, as if a missing piece had clicked into place without him realizing there'd been a gap. He'd spent 3 years convincing himself he preferred solitude, that isolation was safer than connection. But now, listening to the quiet sound of Clara's breathing from across the room, he wondered if he'd been lying to himself all along. The attraction he felt wasn't just physical, though there was that too. It was something deeper, a recognition of kindred damage, of parallel survival. She understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. She knew the cost of building walls and the exhaustion of maintaining them. And maybe, just maybe, she was as tired of being alone as he was. But wanting connection and being capable of it were different things entirely. They were both too broken, too scarred, too afraid of what closeness might cost. The partnership they'd agreed to was safe, transactional, practical, with clear boundaries. Anything more would be dangerous. Elias forced his eyes closed, willing sleep to come. Tomorrow they'd go to town, and he'd need his wits about him. The good citizens of Redemption Springs, he'd always found the town's name grimly ironic, would have questions, opinions, and probably more than a few objections to Clara's presence. He'd deal with that when it came. For now, he just needed to get through the night without doing something stupid, like admitting that having her here felt right in ways that terrified him. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Elias woke to find Clara already up, stoking the fire and making coffee with the efficiency of someone used to early starts. She'd changed into one of her own dresses, still damp and mud-stained, but more presentable than his oversized clothes. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." "You didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." She poured 2 cups and handed him one. "Besides, I've been up for an hour. Couldn't sleep." "Nervous about town?" Clara's jaw tightened fractionally. "I don't get nervous." "Right. My mistake." They drank their coffee in silence, both preparing for the day ahead. Elias retrieved some coins from a tin buried in his floorboards, his savings from the past 3 years, money he'd had no reason to spend. Clara watched with an unreadable expression as he counted out what they'd need. "That's a lot of money," she said quietly. "Building materials aren't cheap. Neither is food that'll last through winter." He pocketed the coins and met her eyes. "I meant what I said yesterday. This is an investment. In you, in the land, in both of us surviving. And if I can't pay you back, then you can't. We'll figure something out." He grabbed his hat from its peg by the door. "Stop borrowing trouble, Clara. We've got enough real problems without inventing more." They hitched up both wagons, Clara's old one and Elias's sturdier but equally weathered vehicle. The plan was to take both into town, load them up, and return with enough supplies to start the rebuild properly. The ride to Redemption Springs was long and hot, the sun climbing steadily as they traveled. They rode side by side when the road permitted, falling into occasional conversation that felt easier than it should have. "What made you choose Arizona?" Elias asked at one point. "I didn't, really. I just kept moving west until I ran out of money and energy." Clara adjusted her grip on the reins. "Figured if I was going to make a stand, might as well be in a place too stubborn to die." That's one way to describe the territory. "What about you? Why here?" Elias was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "After Sarah died, I couldn't stay where we'd been. Too many memories, too many people who looked at me with pity. I needed somewhere that didn't know my story, didn't care about my past. This was as far from civilization as I could get without falling off the edge of the world." Did it help, the distance? Sometimes. Other times it just made the loneliness echo louder. He glanced at her. "What about you? Did running help?" "Not really. Turns out you can't outrun your own mind." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was pain underneath. "The memories follow, the guilt, the fear, all of it. Doesn't matter how many miles you put between yourself and where it happened." "So why keep moving?" "Because staying still felt like giving up, like admitting defeat." She paused. "Until yesterday. When the storm hit and everything fell apart, I realized I'd been running so long I'd forgotten how to stand and fight. And now? Now I'm tired of running." She looked at him, and there was something fierce in her gaze. "This is where I make my stand. Win or lose, this is where it ends." Elias felt something shift in his chest at her words, a recognition that whatever was happening between them, it was moving beyond simple partnership into territory neither of them had mapped. "Then we better make damn sure you win," he said. They reached Redemption Springs just before noon, the small town shimmering in the heat like a mirage. The main street was rutted dirt, lined with false front buildings that tried desperately to project permanence in a place defined by transience. A few horses stood at hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies. Somewhere a dog barked half-heartedly. Elias pulled up in front of Morrison's general store, Clara parking her wagon alongside his. They'd barely dismounted when faces began appearing in windows, and Elias could practically hear the gossip machine starting to churn. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. "I can speak for myself." "I know you can, but Morrison's an old friend, and he'll give us better prices if I handle the negotiation." Clara looked like she wanted to argue, but finally nodded. Fine, but I don't stand there like decoration. I'm part of this. Wouldn't have it any other way. They entered the store together, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of coffee and tobacco and the indefinable scent of 1,000 different goods packed into too small a space. A man emerged from the back room, tall, balding, with spectacles perched on his nose and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Elias Rourke, as I live and breathe. Thought you died out there. It's been so long since you darkened my doorway. Takes more than the Arizona Territory to kill me, Henry. Elias shook the man's hand. I need supplies, lumber, nails, tar paper, food stores, enough to build a cabin and stock it through winter. Henry's gaze shifted to Clara, open curiosity on his face. And who might this be? Clara Whitlock. She's homesteading the old Garrett place. Is she now? Henry's expression shifted, calculation replacing curiosity. Heard someone had filed a claim on that land. Didn't realize it was a woman. Alone? That's none of your concern, Clara said, her voice pleasant but with steel underneath. What is your concern is whether you're going to sell us those supplies or if we need to ride to the next town. Henry blinked, clearly not used to being spoken to that way by a woman. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. I like her, Elias. She's got spine. He turned back to Clara. No offense intended, ma'am. Just don't see many women willing to take on homesteading by themselves. Well, now you've seen one. Clara moved to the counter, all business. We'll need 300 board feet of lumber, 10 pounds of nails, 2 rolls of tar paper, 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of salt pork, coffee, sugar, and any other provisions you'd recommend for someone stocking a new homestead. Henry whistled low. That's quite an order, going to cost— I have money, Elias interrupted, pulling out his coins. And I'm good for credit if it runs over. The storekeeper's eyes sharpened. So you're helping her set up? That's neighborly of you. We're partners, Clara said before Elias could respond. Helping each other survive. That a problem? No problem at all, but Henry's expression suggested he was filing this information away for future gossip. I'll start pulling your order together. Might take an hour or so to get it all loaded. We'll wait, Elias said. As Henry disappeared into the back room, calling for his assistant, Clara turned to Elias. Partners? She said quietly. That's what we're calling it? You have a better term? No, I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. She glanced toward the window, where several faces were now pressed against the glass, watching them with undisguised interest. Looks like your prediction about gossip was accurate. Small towns are the same everywhere. Give them something to talk about. Great. Just what I needed. The door opened and a woman entered, late 50s, dressed in severe black, with iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Her eyes went immediately to Clara, scanning her from head to toe with obvious disapproval. Mrs. Hendricks, Elias said, his tone carefully neutral. Mr. Rourke. The woman's voice could have frozen water. I heard rumors you'd brought a woman to town. I see they weren't exaggerated. Mrs. Hendricks, this is Clara Whitlock. She's filed a claim on the Garrett property. How unfortunate. That land is cursed. Poor Frank Garrett proved that. Mrs. Hendricks' gaze remained fixed on Clara. And you're attempting this venture alone? Without a husband or family? I am, Clara said, her voice level but cool. How unconventional. The older woman's lips pursed. I suppose modern women have different standards of propriety than those of us raised in civilized society. Elias felt anger flare, but Clara spoke before he could. If civilization means standing by while others dictate how I should live my life, then I'm happy to be uncivilized. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have supplies to purchase. Mrs. Hendricks' face flushed red. Well, I never. Clearly. Clara turned her back dismissively, moving to examine some cooking implements on a nearby shelf. The older woman sputtered for a moment, then turned on her heel and marched out, the door slamming behind her. Elias waited until she was gone before allowing himself to smile. You just made an enemy. I've had worse. Clara held up a cast-iron skillet, testing its weight. At least she was honest about her disapproval. I can respect that more than false friendliness. Fair enough, but Mrs. Hendricks runs the women's auxiliary and half the social functions in town. She can make life difficult. Then it's lucky I don't plan on attending social functions. Henry emerged from the back, arms loaded with supplies. Got most of what you need here. Lumber will take some time to cut and load. Why don't you two grab some lunch at the saloon while we work? On the house, call it a welcome to the territory gift for Miss Whitlock. Clara looked like she wanted to refuse, but Elias caught her eye and shook his head slightly. That's generous of you, Henry. We'll take you up on it. Outside, the street was busier now, more people going about their daily business. But Elias was acutely aware of the stares that followed them, the whispered conversations that stopped when they drew near. The saloon was at the far end of the street, a weathered building with swinging doors and the promise of shade. They'd made it halfway there when a man stepped out from the sheriff's office, blocking their path. Sheriff Tom Brennan was in his 40s, lean and weathered, with a badge pinned to his vest and a gun on his hip. His eyes were sharp and assessing as he took in both of them. Elias, heard you were in town. Sheriff, just picking up supplies. So I heard. Brennan's gaze shifted to Clara. You'd be the woman claiming the Garrett land. I would. Mind if I ask what brings a lady like yourself to these parts? Clara's posture stiffened. The same thing that brings anyone west. Opportunity. Opportunity? The sheriff's tone suggested skepticism. Or maybe you're running from something. That's enough, Tom, Elias said, his voice hard. Miss Whitlock's business is her own. She's filed her claim legally, and she's entitled to the same treatment as any other settler. Easy, Elias. I'm just looking out for the town's interests. We get all kinds passing through. Some looking for fresh starts, others looking to cause trouble. It's my job to know which is which. Then do your job, Clara said, her voice icy. Check my claim papers if you want. You'll find everything in order, but unless you're planning to arrest me for the crime of being a woman with a homestead, I suggest you step aside. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but something in Clara's gaze must have convinced him not to push further. He stepped back, touching the brim of his hat. Welcome to Redemption Springs, ma'am. I hope you find what you're looking for. I already have. Land that's mine and nobody else's. They continued toward the saloon, Elias's hand hovering near Clara's elbow without quite touching. Once they were out of earshot, she said quietly, That went well? You're making quite an impression. Let me guess. Not a good one? Depends on who you ask. The women think you're scandalous, the sheriff thinks you're suspicious, and the men... He trailed off. The men think I'm prey. Clara's voice was flat. I know that look, Elias. I've been seeing it since Thomas died. They entered the saloon and conversation died as every head turned toward them. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a magnificent mustache, broke the silence. Elias Rourke! Damn me, man. Thought you'd become a hermit. What brings you to civilization? Supplies, Jack, and a meal, if you've got something that won't kill us. Got stew that's only moderately toxic. Take a seat. They found a table in the corner, away from the main crowd, but with a clear view of the door. Old habits, Elias thought. Clara sat with her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room with the same vigilance he felt. The stew arrived quickly, thick with vegetables and mystery meat, but hot and filling. They ate in silence, both aware of the attention still focused on them. This is going to be complicated, isn't it? Clara said eventually. Probably. Small town, woman alone, man helping her. People will talk. Let them. I don't care what they think. But I do. Elias set down his spoon, meeting her eyes. Not for my sake, but for yours. Their opinions might not matter to you now, but come winter, when you need help or supplies, when something goes wrong and you need neighbors to step up, that's when having people on your side matters. Clara was quiet for a moment, then sighed. You're right, I'm not good at playing nice, at pretending to be something I'm not. Then don't pretend. Just don't go out of your way to antagonize everyone either. There's a middle ground. Is there? She looked at him with something that might have been vulnerability. Because I've never found it. I'm either too much or not enough, never just right. You're right enough for me, Elias said, then immediately regretted it when he saw her expression shift. I mean, for the partnership, you're adequate. Clara laughed, a real laugh that transformed her face. Adequate. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in years. They finished their meal in better spirits, and by the time they returned to Morrison's store, the wagons were loaded and ready. Henry presented them with a bill that made Elias wince, but he paid it without complaint. "You need anything else, you come see me," Henry said, shaking Elias's hand. "And Miss Whitlock, you're welcome in my store any time. Don't let the likes of Mrs. Hendricks make you think otherwise." "Thank you," Clara said, and she actually smiled. "I appreciate that." They were preparing to leave when a young woman approached, maybe 19 or 20, pretty in a fragile way with blonde hair and uncertain eyes. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Miss Whitlock, I'm Sarah Mae Carson. I just wanted to say, well, I think what you're doing is brave. Claiming land by yourself, not waiting for a man to give you permission to have a life." She glanced around nervously. "Not everyone thinks so, but some of us do." Clara's expression softened. "Thank you, Miss Carson. That means more than you know." The young woman hurried away, but her words lingered. As they drove out of town, Clara was quiet, staring at the horizon with an unreadable expression. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked. "That maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. That maybe there are other people out here who understand what it means to want something more than what's expected. There are. You just have to find them. Or let them find me." They rode in companionable silence, the loaded wagons creaking behind them. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Ahead, somewhere in that vast expanse of desert, was the land that Clara had claimed and the life she was trying to build. And beside her, whether either of them was ready to admit it or not, was someone who'd begun to believe that maybe survival wasn't enough. That maybe, just maybe, there was something worth living for after all. The work of rebuilding began at first light the next morning. Elias arrived at the Garrett property to find Clara already there, standing amid the cleared wreckage with a piece of charcoal and a flat board, sketching out dimensions with surprising precision. "You know architecture?" he asked, studying her rough plans. "I know enough. Thomas and I built our first cabin together in Nebraska. I learned by doing." She didn't look up from her work. 4 walls, sloped roof for water runoff, door facing east to catch morning light, window on the south wall for warmth. Nothing fancy, but it'll stand. "We should reinforce the foundation this time. Dig deeper, use stone if we can find it. Last thing you need is another collapse." Clara nodded, making a notation on her sketch. "There's a dry creek bed about a mile north. Might be good stone there. I'll take the wagon and check it out. You start marking where the corner posts need to go." They worked separately for the first few hours, each focused on their tasks. But as the sun climbed higher, they began to orbit each other, their paths crossing and recrossing as the work demanded. A question here, a suggestion there, small moments of collaboration that felt increasingly natural. By midday, they'd marked out the foundation and collected enough stone to begin. The work was backbreaking, hauling rocks, digging post holes in earth baked hard by the sun, mixing mortar from clay and water. But they fell into a rhythm, trading off tasks without needing to discuss who did what. "You're stronger than you look," Elias observed, watching Clara heft a stone that had to weigh 40 pounds. "And you're more observant than I gave you credit for." She set the stone in place, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Though that's not saying much, considering I thought you were just a hermit with a rifle. What do you think now?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them in the heat shimmer. "I think you're more complicated than a hermit, and probably more dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "The kind that makes you forget why you built walls in the first place." The honesty of it hung between them like a live wire. Elias felt his pulse quicken, felt the magnetic pull he'd been trying to ignore for days now. But before he could respond, Clara turned away, reaching for another stone. "We should keep working. Won't get this done standing around talking." They didn't speak much for the rest of the afternoon, but the silence felt charged, loaded with things neither of them was ready to say. By evening, they'd laid the foundation stones and set the first 2 corner posts. It was hard-won progress, but it was progress nonetheless. "You should stay for dinner," Elias said as the sun began its descent. "No sense riding back in the dark." "I can manage." "I know you can. But I'm offering anyway. Consider it payment for your labor today. Partnership works both ways." Clara studied him, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. All right, but I help cook. At the cabin, they worked side by side in the small kitchen space, preparing a meal from Elias's stores. There was something domestic about it, something that felt both comfortable and dangerous. Clara moved around the space with growing familiarity, knowing now where he kept the salt, which pan he preferred for frying. "Tell me about Sarah," she said suddenly, slicing potatoes with steady hands. "If you want to, I mean. You don't have to." Elias paused in his work, surprised by the question. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you mentioned her once, and then never again. Because I can see her absence in every corner of this cabin, and because—" Clara set down her knife, meeting his eyes. "Because if we're going to be partners, really be partners, we should know each other's ghosts." He understood what she meant. The dead had weight, shaped the living in ways that couldn't be ignored, and she'd already shared some of her pain with him. It was only fair to reciprocate. "We met back in Missouri," he began, resuming his work so he wouldn't have to maintain eye contact. "I was working on her father's ranch, saving money to head west. She was 17, all fire and determination, wanted to see the world beyond her father's property line. We fell hard and fast, the way young people do when they don't know any better. Her father approved? Hell no. But Sarah didn't care. We eloped, headed west with nothing but a wagon and dreams bigger than the sky." He smiled at the memory, bittersweet as it was. "First year was hard, harder than either of us expected. But we survived it together, started building something real, and then she got pregnant." His voice caught, and he had to pause, forcing the words through the tightness in his throat. "She was so happy. Talked about names, about teaching our son to ride, about the family we'd build. And I believed her, believed we'd beaten the odds, that we'd actually make it work. What happened? Labor went on too long, 3 days of agony while I stood helpless, watching her suffer. When the midwife finally came from town, it was too late. Baby was positioned wrong, cord wrapped around his neck. Sarah hemorrhaged, and there was nothing anyone could do. She died holding my hand, apologizing for failing me." Clara's hand found his, squeezing gently. "She didn't fail you." "I know that now, but in the moment, all I could think was that I'd killed her, that my dream of building a life out here had cost her everything." "That's not your fault, isn't it? I was the one who insisted on coming to the frontier. She would have been fine staying in Missouri, living a safe, predictable life. But I wanted more, wanted to prove I could build something from nothing, and it killed her. You don't know that. Women die in childbirth everywhere, not just on the frontier. And from what you've told me, Sarah chose this life too. She wasn't some helpless victim dragged west against her will." Elias looked at her, seeing the fierce conviction in Clara's eyes. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am. After Thomas died, people kept telling me it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done. But I blame myself anyway. Thought if I'd just been faster, smarter, better somehow, I could have saved him." She released his hand, returning to her work. "Took me a long time to accept that some things are beyond our control. That loss isn't always someone's fault. Sometimes it's just life. Brutal and unfair and meaningless." They finished cooking in silence, both lost in their respective grief. But when they sat down to eat, something had shifted. The ghosts were still there, would always be there, but they felt less oppressive somehow. Shared pain was lighter than solitary suffering. "Thank you," Elias said quietly, "for listening, for understanding. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell it." They ate slowly, savoring the simple meal and the companionship. Outside, darkness fell complete and absolute, the kind of darkness that only existed far from civilization. But inside the cabin, lamplight created a warm bubble against the void. "It's late," Clara said eventually, glancing toward the window. "I should head back." "You can stay. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "Elias, I know you're capable and independent and don't need protecting, but it's a new moon, dark as pitch out there, and the desert's more dangerous at night. Just stay, please." The please seemed to disarm her. She nodded slowly. "All right, but we stick to the arrangement. I'll take the floor tonight, you take the bed." "Clara, those were the terms. Don't go getting noble on me now." He wanted to argue, but he could see the stubborn set of her jaw and knew it would be pointless. "Fine, but you take extra blankets. Floor gets cold." They prepared for sleep with the awkward awareness of two people trying not to acknowledge the intimacy of the situation. Clara made a nest by the fire while Elias climbed into bed, both of them carefully not looking at each other. "Good night," he said into the darkness. "Good night." Elias lay awake for a long time, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper against the cabin walls. Across the room, he could hear Clara's breathing, could sense her wakefulness matching his own. "Elias?" Her voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah?" "Why are you really helping me? And don't say partnership or neighboring. I want the truth." He considered lying, maintaining the safe distance they'd both been clinging to. But the darkness made honesty easier somehow, stripped away the need for pretense. "Because when you showed up, I realized I'd been existing, not living, just going through the motions, waiting for, I don't know what, an end, maybe. And then you came along all fierce independence and stubborn pride, refusing to let this land break you. And it reminded me what it felt like to want something, to fight for something beyond just surviving another day." Silence greeted his words. Then so quietly he almost missed it. "I feel the same way. About you, I mean. You make me remember that there are good people left in the world. People who help without expecting something in return. People worth trusting. That scares you. Terrifies me." A pause. "But not as much as the alternative." They didn't speak again that night, but something had been acknowledged, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd moved beyond simple partnership into territory neither of them had intended to enter. And as sleep finally claimed them both, the frontier waited and watched, patient and implacable, ready to test the fragile connection they were building. The days that followed fell into a pattern. They'd meet at the construction site at dawn, work until the heat became unbearable, rest during midday, then continue until dusk. The cabin rose slowly but steadily, walls taking shape, window frames fitted, rafters assembled on the ground ready to raise. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and observations, building a map of each other's lives. Elias learned that Clara had grown up in Pennsylvania, daughter of a coal miner who died in a cave-in when she was 12. That she'd met Thomas at a church social, married him at 18, followed him west full of hope and naivety. Clara learned that Elias had been a soldier briefly during the tail end of the Civil War, too young to see real action, but old enough to be marked by what he witnessed. That he drifted for years after, working ranches and mines and freight lines, until he'd met Sarah and found a reason to settle. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, the way Clara hummed tunelessly when she was concentrating, the way Elias would pause mid-task to stare at the horizon, lost in thought. Small intimacies that built a foundation more solid than stone. But they also learned each other's limits. Clara's fierce need for independence meant she'd often refuse help even when she clearly needed it, pushing herself to exhaustion rather than admit weakness. Elias's tendency toward silence meant he'd withdraw when emotions ran high, disappearing into himself rather than confronting what he felt. They fought sometimes. Quick flare-ups over methodology or stubbornness, arguments that burned hot and fast before dissipating. But they always came back together, unable to maintain distance even when anger demanded it. "You're impossible," Clara said one afternoon, throwing down her hammer in frustration. "I told you that beam needs to be cut at an angle, not straight. And I'm telling you straight will hold just as well and takes half the time. It's not about time, it's about doing it right." "Right according to who?" "You? Because last I checked, we're both building this cabin, which means we both get a say." They glared at each other across the partially built wall, both breathing hard, both too stubborn to back down. Then, simultaneously, they both started laughing at the absurdity of it. "We're ridiculous," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "Completely." Elias picked up the beam in question, examining it critically. "Tell you what, we cut it at an angle, but if it takes too long, you owe me an apology. And if it works perfectly, you owe me one. Deal." The beam, cut at an angle, fit perfectly and required no adjustments. Elias grudgingly admitted she'd been right, and Clara graciously didn't gloat too much. But the argument had cleared the air, reminded them both that they could disagree without destroying what they were building. 3 weeks into the construction, a rider appeared on the horizon. Elias spotted him first, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle, but as the figure drew closer, he relaxed slightly. It's Sheriff Brennan, he told Clara, who'd gone tense beside him. Let me handle this. Like hell. This is my land. The sheriff rode up slowly, taking in the construction with assessing eyes. Making progress, I see. What brings you out here, Tom? Elias kept his voice neutral. Just checking on things, making sure everything's appropriate. Clara stepped forward. Appropriate how, Sheriff? Last I checked, building a cabin on my own land wasn't a crime. No, ma'am, it's not. But there's been talk in town about you and Mr. Rourke, about the nature of your partnership. Let me guess, Clara's voice dripped ice. Mrs. Hendricks and her cronies think we're living in sin. Brennan had the grace to look uncomfortable. Something like that. Look, I don't care what you two do or don't do, but appearances matter, and a single woman living on land next to a single man, the two of them spending all their time together, it raises questions. Then people should mind their own damn business, Elias said flatly. Maybe so. But I've got a job to do, which includes keeping the peace, and scandalous behavior, real or imagined, disrupts that peace. Clara's laugh was harsh. Scandalous. I'm rebuilding a cabin. That's my scandal. I'm just saying, it might be wise to consider how things look. Maybe have some other women around when you're working. Or build on separate days. Something to quiet the gossip. Or, Clara said, her voice deadly calm, people could accept that a woman is allowed to own land, build a cabin, and choose her own company without needing male approval or female chaperones. Revolutionary concept, I know. The sheriff sighed. I'm not the enemy here, Miss Whitlock. I'm just trying to help you avoid trouble. By asking me to restrict my life to make other people comfortable? That's not help, Sheriff. That's surrender. Brennan looked at Elias. Talk some sense into her. She doesn't need sense talked into her. She needs to be left alone to live her life. Elias moved to stand beside Clara, a united front. You've done your duty, Tom. You've delivered the town's concerns. Now you can ride back and tell them those concerns have been noted and dismissed. The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, then he shrugged. Your funeral. But don't say I didn't warn you when Mrs. Hendricks and her committee come calling. He rode away, leaving them standing in the skeleton of the cabin. Clara was shaking with barely contained rage. Self-righteous hypocrites, she spat, hiding their prejudice behind concern for morality. They're scared, Elias said quietly. You represent something that threatens their entire worldview. A woman who doesn't need a man, doesn't follow the rules, doesn't apologize for existing. Of course they want to control you. Let them try. Clara turned back to the cabin, picking up her hammer with renewed fury. I didn't survive everything I've survived to let some small-minded busybodies dictate how I live. But despite her defiance, Elias could see the worry in her eyes. The frontier was hard enough without having the town against you, and while he didn't care about his own reputation, he'd already isolated himself from Redemption Springs years ago, he cared about Clara's ability to survive here. Maybe we should be more careful, he said carefully. Not because they're right, but because making enemies serves no purpose. You want me to pretend we're not working together, to sneak around like we're doing something wrong? No. But maybe we don't need to spend every waking moment side by side. I can work on my own property some days, you work here. Maintain some distance, just for appearances. Clara's eyes flashed. Is that what you want? Distance? No, he admitted. But I want you to survive here. And that means choosing your battles. I'm tired of choosing battles based on other people's comfort. I'm tired of making myself smaller so others feel bigger. She stepped closer to him, and he could see the fire in her eyes, the absolute refusal to bend. If the price of survival is becoming someone I'm not, then maybe survival isn't worth it. You don't mean that, don't I? She held his gaze, unflinching. What's the point of living if you have to kill who you are to do it? Elias had no answer for that. Because she was right, in a way that cut to the bone. He'd survived these past 3 years, but he'd done it by shutting down everything that made life worth living. And it had worked, after a fashion. He was still breathing, still functioning, but he hadn't been alive. Not really. Not until she'd shown up and reminded him what it felt like to fight for something beyond mere existence. Then we do it your way, he said, finally. We build this cabin together, in plain sight, and let them think what they want. But Clara, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. You need to be prepared for that. I'm always prepared for harder. It's easier, I don't trust. They returned to work, but the sheriff's visit had cast a shadow over the day. They were both quieter, more aware of how their actions might be perceived, more conscious of the judgment that would follow. That evening, as they prepared to part ways, Clara said, "You don't have to keep helping me. If it's causing you problems, it's not. But it will. The town will turn on you too if you keep associating with the scandalous widow woman. Let them." Elias held her gaze. "I told you. I stopped caring what they thought years ago. I'm not about to start again now." "Why?" The question was raw, vulnerable. "Why would you risk your standing in the only community for miles just to help me?" "Because I'm falling for you," Elias thought. "Because working beside you makes me feel alive again. Because the thought of you facing this alone makes my chest ache in ways I'd forgotten were possible." But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because you'd do the same for me." Clara searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded. "I would. You're right about that." She climbed onto her wagon, preparing to head back to Elias's cabin where she'd been staying most nights now, the arrangement having become routine. But before she could leave, Elias found himself speaking. "Clara, what the sheriff said about appearances and propriety, if you're about to suggest I move to town or find somewhere else to stay, I'm suggesting the opposite." The words came out in a rush before he could second-guess them. "Stay. Officially. Move your things into the cabin. Stop pretending you're just visiting. If they're going to talk anyway, at least we'll be comfortable." She stared at him, clearly not having expected that. "You know what that would mean. What they'd assume." "I know, but we'd know the truth. And that's all that matters." "Is it?" "Because once we cross that line, Elias, there's no going back. The town will brand us both, and every interaction we have will be viewed through that lens." "I know." He stepped closer to the wagon, looking up at her. "But I'm tired of living my life based on what other people think. You were right earlier. If survival means killing who we are, it's not worth it. So let's just be." "Whatever that looks like." Claire's expression softened, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she blinked it back, nodding once. "All right, I'll move my things tomorrow." She drove away, leaving Elias standing in the gathering darkness, wondering what exactly he'd just set in motion. He'd meant the offer as a practical solution, a way to simplify their lives and stop sneaking around. But even as he told himself that, he knew it was more complicated. Having Clara in his space full-time would change things, would blur the lines they'd been carefully maintaining between partnership and something deeper, would force them both to confront feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. But maybe that was long overdue. Maybe they'd been lying to themselves, pretending this was just about survival and neighboring when it had become something else entirely. Back at the cabin, Elias stared at the space that would soon hold Clara's belongings, her presence becoming permanent rather than temporary. The thought should have terrified him. After 3 years of isolation, 3 years of keeping everyone at arm's length, he was inviting someone in completely. But instead of fear, he felt something else, something that might have been hope or anticipation or the first stirrings of a feeling he'd thought died with Sarah. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced from the town or the land or their own damaged hearts, they'd face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The next morning, Clara arrived with her few possessions packed into the wagon: clothes, a few cooking implements, a battered book that looked like it had been read 1,000 times. It wasn't much, the accumulated belongings of someone who'd learned to travel light, to leave quickly when necessary. "That's everything?" Elias asked, helping her unload. "I've never been one for accumulating things. Too many possessions weigh you down, make it harder to run when you need to." "You planning on running?" She met his eyes. "Not anymore, but old habits die hard." They settled her things into the cabin, Clara claiming a corner for her belongings, hanging her spare dress on a peg near his. The domesticity of it felt strange and right in equal measure. "We should set some ground rules," Clara said, ever practical. "About space, about privacy, about—" "We'll figure it out as we go," Elias interrupted. "We're both adults. We'll manage." And they did, surprisingly well. They developed routines and rhythms, learning to share space that had been solitary for so long. Morning coffee together, quiet conversations by the fire at night, the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. But beneath the domesticity, tension simmered. They were both too aware of each other now, the proximity highlighting every glance, every accidental touch, every moment when their eyes would meet and hold just a fraction too long. The cabin walls grew higher, approaching completion, and with each board they nailed in place, each stone they mortared into position, they built something else too. A connection that went deeper than partnership, stronger than friendship, dangerous in its intensity. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but they both felt it, this thing growing between them like a storm building on the horizon. Inevitable, unstoppable, and coming sooner than either of them was ready to face. The roof went up on a morning when the sky burned brilliant and cloudless, the kind of perfect day the desert offered as apology for all its cruelties. Elias and Clara stood beneath the completed frame, looking up at the rafters they'd wrestled into place over the past week. "It's ready," Clara said, her voice catching slightly. "We can finish it today." They'd been working toward this moment for nearly 6 weeks now, every board and nail representing hours of labor under the relentless sun. The cabin stood solid and square, walls plumb, corners true, a structure built to last. All that remained was laying the roof planks and sealing them with tar paper. "Then let's finish it," Elias said. They climbed onto the frame together, moving with the synchronized efficiency they'd developed over weeks of working side by side. Board after board went down, nailed secure, each one bringing them closer to completion. The sun climbed higher, sweat soaked their clothes, but neither suggested stopping. This was more than construction. This was Clara's declaration of permanence, her refusal to be driven away by storm or scandal or the sheer brutality of frontier life. And Elias understood that completing this cabin meant something profound for both of them, a line crossed, a future claimed. By early afternoon, they laid the final board. Clara drove the last nail herself, 3 solid strikes that rang out across the empty land like a bell. Then she sat back on her heels, looking down at what they'd built. "It's done," she said, wonder in her voice. "It's actually done." Elias sat beside her, both of them perched on the roof they'd created, looking out across the landscape that had tried so hard to break her. "You did it. You survived. We did it." She turned to him, and her eyes were bright with emotion. "I couldn't have done this alone, Elias. No matter what I told myself, no matter how much I wanted to prove I didn't need anyone, I needed you. I need you." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt every defense he'd built over 3 years of isolation crumbling like sand. "Clara, wait, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "I came here planning to be alone for the rest of my life. I was so sure that was safer, that isolation was the only way to protect myself from being hurt again. But these past weeks with you, building this cabin, building whatever this is between us, it's made me realize something." "What's that?" "That being safe and being alive aren't the same thing. And I don't want to just be safe anymore. I want to live. With you. If you'll have me." Elias stared at her, this fierce, complicated woman who'd crashed into his carefully constructed solitude and demolished it completely. He should be terrified, should be backing away, protecting himself, maintaining the distance that had kept him functioning. But looking at Clara, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, and the hope she was trying so hard to hide, he realized he didn't want distance, didn't want safety, didn't want anything except this. Her, here, real and solid, and choosing him. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself this was just partnership or neighboring or whatever excuse I could find. But the truth is, I fell for you the moment you pointed that derringer at those raiders and refused to back down. You're everything I thought I'd never find again, strength and courage and a will that won't break. So yes, I'll have you, if you'll have a broken-down hermit who doesn't know the first thing about how to do this anymore." Clara's laugh was half sob. "I think we're both pretty broken, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we can be broken together." She leaned in, and Elias met her halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that tasted of salt and dust and promise. It was gentle at first, tentative, 2 people who'd forgotten how to be gentle relearning the language. Then Clara's hand came up to cup his face. And the kiss deepened, 3 years of loneliness and grief pouring into it from both sides. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. What do we do now? Now? Clara smiled, and it transformed her face into something radiant. Now we climb down from this roof before we fall off. And then we figure out the rest as we go. They descended carefully, testing each board as they climbed down the ladder. On solid ground again, they stood hand in hand looking up at the completed cabin. I should move my things over, Clara said. Make this place actually livable. Or, Elias said carefully, you could leave them where they are. At my place. Our place. She turned to look at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're asking me to stay? Permanently? I'm asking you to build a life with me. Use this cabin for storage, for guests if any ever show up, for whatever you want. But live with me. Partner with me. Love me if you can. I already do. Clara squeezed his hand. But Elias, you know what this means. What the town will say. What they'll assume. Let them assume. Let them talk. I don't care anymore. He pulled her closer. Unless you do. Unless you want something more official, more respectable. Because if you do, I can… Stop. She pressed her fingers to his lips. I don't need official or respectable. I just need honest. And this, us, is the most honest thing I've felt in years. They sealed it with another kiss, longer this time, the Arizona sun blazing down on them like a benediction. When they finally broke apart, Clara was grinning. We should celebrate, finish the cabin properly. What did you have in mind? There's a bottle of whiskey I've been saving since before the storm, hidden in my wagon because I didn't trust you not to drink it. Elias laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Smart woman. They retrieved the bottle and 2 tin cups, then climbed back up onto the roof, carefully, mindful of their earlier kiss-induced distraction. Sitting side by side with their legs dangling over the edge, they toasted the completed cabin and the uncertain future it represented. To survival, Clara said, raising her cup. To more than survival, Elias corrected. To actually living. They drank, the whiskey burning warm down their throats. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in the violent colors the desert did best, crimson and gold and purple so deep it was almost black. I used to hate sunsets, Clara said quietly. After Thomas died, every sunset felt like a reminder that another day had passed without him. Another day I'd survived when he hadn't. It felt wrong, somehow. Unfair. And now? Now they feel like possibility. Like proof that endings can be beautiful. That something can die and the world keeps turning, and maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's just life. Elias understood what she meant. He'd spent 3 years seeing every sunset as just another day survived, nothing more. But now, sitting beside Clara on the roof of the cabin they'd built together, watching the light show across the sky, it felt like more than survival. It felt like hope. They finished the bottle as the stars emerged, talking and laughing and occasionally falling into comfortable silence. The desert night wrapped around them, cool after the day's heat, infinite above them. We should probably go inside, Clara said eventually, though she made no move to stand, before we fall asleep up here and tumble off in the night. Probably. But Elias didn't move either. Clara? Thank you. For what? For being stubborn enough not to leave when anyone sensible would have. For forcing me to remember what it feels like to care about something. For choosing me, even though I'm perfect exactly as you are, she interrupted. Broken and healed and strong enough to help someone else survive their own breaking. That's what you are, Elias Rourke, and that's what I'm choosing. They climbed down finally, exhaustion making them clumsy but careful. At Elias's cabin, their cabin now, they prepared for bed with the easy intimacy of people who'd already been living together, just without acknowledging what it meant. But tonight was different. Tonight, when Clara moved toward the bed instead of making her usual nest by the fire, Elias followed. They lay down together, fully clothed, awkward and uncertain, but unwilling to spend another night apart. Is this okay? Clara asked, her voice small in the darkness. More than okay. Elias found her hand, threading their fingers together. This is everything. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped between them, Two broken people finding wholeness in each other's proximity. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias's dreams weren't haunted by loss. They were filled instead with possibility. The trouble came, as Elias had known it would, 2 days later. They were working on finishing touches to Clara's cabin, installing the door, hanging shutters for the window, when they spotted the delegation approaching. 4 wagons, maybe a dozen people, led by Mrs. Hendricks in her severe black dress. "Here we go," Elias muttered. "Let me handle this." Like hell, Clara set down her hammer and moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front. "We handle it together." The wagons pulled up, and Mrs. Hendricks climbed down with the assistance of one of her cronies, a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Talbot, who looked like she'd been weaned on vinegar. "Mr. Rourke, Miss Whitlock." Mrs. Hendricks' voice could have frozen the desert. "We need to have a conversation about the situation here." "What situation would that be?" Clara's tone matched the older woman's for coldness. "Don't play coy. The entire town knows you've been living in sin with Mr. Rourke, shacking up like common." "Careful," Elias interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "Very careful what you say next." Mrs. Hendricks drew herself up. "I speak only the truth. You've brought shame upon yourself and this community, both of you, and we've come to demand it stop." "Demand?" Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. "You came all the way out here to demand that I stop living my life in a way you disapprove of? That's fascinating. Tell me, Mrs. Hendricks, who made you arbiter of morality?" "Decency made me so. Christian values made me so." "Interesting, because I don't recall decency involving showing up uninvited on someone's property to pass judgment on their personal lives. Your personal life becomes community business when you flaunt it so openly, when you corrupt the morals of impressionable young people." Mrs. Hendricks gestured to the wagons, and Elias saw young Sarah Mae Carson among the group, looking miserable. "Girls like Sarah Mae here, who need to learn proper behavior, not see an example of loose living." "I'm not loose," Clara said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I'm a widow who's building a life on land I legally own with help from my neighbor. If your mind goes somewhere sordid, that says more about you than me. Don't you dare. I'll dare whatever I please on my own property." Clara stepped forward, and Mrs. Hendricks actually flinched. "You don't like how I live? Fine. Don't visit. Don't speak to me in town. Pretend I don't exist. But do not come to my land and tell me how to live my life. Those days are over. The sheriff will hear of this. The town council can go to hell," Elias said flatly, "along with anyone else who thinks they have a say in what happens between 2 consenting adults on private property." Mrs. Talbot gasped. "Such language! Such disrespect!" "You want to see disrespect?" Elias moved to stand beside Clara. "You came here to bully and shame a woman who's done nothing wrong. You brought witnesses to intimidate her, to make her feel small and sinful for daring to exist outside your narrow definitions. That's disrespect. What we're giving you is honesty." "We're trying to save your souls," Mrs. Hendricks insisted, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "We don't need saving," Clara said. "We need to be left alone. So take your delegation, your judgment, and your self-righteousness back to town. And don't come back unless you're prepared to apologize." "Apologize? We're not—" "Then leave. Now." For a long moment, the women stared at each other, Mrs. Hendricks with her rigid morality and Clara with her unbending will. Finally, the older woman turned away. "This isn't over. The town will take action." "Let them try," Clara called after her. "I've survived worse than small-town gossip." The delegation climbed back into their wagons and departed, leaving dust and tension in their wake. But before they'd gone completely, Sarah Mae Carson jumped down from one of the wagons and ran back toward them. "Miss Whitlock, wait!" The girl was breathless when she reached them, her face flushed with emotion. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to come, but my mother made me. She's friends with Mrs. Hendricks and—" "It's all right," Clara said gently. "You're not responsible for their actions. But I want you to know, some of us don't think that way. Some of us think what you're doing is brave. Building your own life, choosing your own path. I think it's inspiring." Clara's expression softened completely. "Thank you, Sarah Mae," That means more than you know. I should go before they leave me behind, but I just wanted to say, don't let them make you small. Don't let them win. She ran back to the wagons, and they watched her climb aboard just before the group disappeared over the ridge. That girl's got spine, Elias observed. She does. Clara turned to him, and he could see the toll the confrontation had taken in the tightness around her eyes. They're going to keep coming, aren't they? Keep trying to force us to conform. Probably. Small towns don't like change, and you represent a lot of change. Can we survive it? Their judgment, their interference? Elias pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. We can survive anything. We've already proven that. And whatever they throw at us, we face it together. Clara buried her face in his chest, and he felt her shaking, not with fear, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and anger. He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out. I'm tired of fighting, she whispered, so tired of always having to defend my right to exist. Then don't fight them. Live your life so completely, so joyfully, that their opinions become meaningless. That's the real victory, not beating them, but making them irrelevant. She pulled back to look at him. When did you get so wise? About 5 minutes ago. I'm making this up as I go. Clara laughed, the sound breaking the tension. Good. I'd be worried if you had all the answers. They returned to work on the cabin, refusing to let the confrontation derail their progress. By evening, the door was hung and the shutters installed. Clara's cabin was complete. 4 walls, a roof, a future. They stood in the doorway together, looking at the empty interior that waited to be filled. What will you use it for? Elias asked. I don't know yet. Storage, maybe? Or a workshop, or... She paused, something flickering across her face. Or someday, if we're lucky, maybe a place for a family to grow. The implication made Elias's breath catch. They hadn't talked about the future in concrete terms, hadn't planned beyond the next day or week, but hearing Clara speak of family, of a future that extended beyond just survival, made something tight in his chest loosen. You want that? Children? Someday, maybe, if it happens. She looked up at him. Does that scare you? Terrifies me, he admitted. After what happened with Sarah, the thought of going through that again. We don't have to. We can just be us, build our life without that complication. I just wanted you to know I'm open to it, if the time comes and we both want it. Elias pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. Let's get through one season at a time. Winter's coming, and that'll be its own challenge. We can worry about the rest later. Together? Always together. The weeks that followed were busy with preparation for winter. They stockpiled firewood, preserved food, reinforced both cabins against the cold that would come. They worked side by side through shortening days and lengthening nights, building not just physical stores but emotional resilience. The town's disapproval manifested in small ways: cold shoulders at the general store, whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, pointed exclusion from community events. But they also found unexpected allies. Henry Morrison continued to extend them credit and fair prices. Sheriff Brennan, while not approving, stopped interfering. And slowly, a few others began to thaw. Sarah Mae Carson visited one afternoon, bringing fresh bread from her mother's kitchen and staying to help Clara organize the interior of her new cabin. Other young women followed her lead, ones who chafed against the rigid expectations of frontier society, who saw in Clara's independence a possibility they'd never considered before. The men were harder to read, their approval or disapproval more carefully concealed. But Elias noticed that when he went to town for supplies, more of them were willing to talk, to ask questions about the construction, to acknowledge his presence rather than pretending he didn't exist. The scandal, it seemed, was losing its power. Not because people stopped caring, but because Clara and Elias simply continued living, neither flaunting their relationship nor hiding it, just existing in quiet defiance of expectations. The first snow came in late November, dusting the desert in white that looked impossible against the red rock and brown earth. They woke to it together, Clara's head pillowed on Elias's shoulder, both of them watching through the window as fat flakes drifted down. It's beautiful, Clara whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. It is. But Elias wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at her, at the peace in her face, the contentment that had slowly replaced the brittle defensiveness she'd worn like armor when they first met. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching him staring. "That I love you, that I want to marry you, make this official and legal, and everything those old biddies in town think we should have done months ago." Clara went very still. "Elias, I know we said we didn't need official, and we don't, not really, but I want it anyway. Want to stand up in front of whoever will witness it and claim you as mine, claim this life we're building. Not because society demands it, but because I choose it, choose you, every day for the rest of however many days we have." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." "Is that a yes?" "That's an absolutely yes." She kissed him, deep and thorough, the kind of kiss that made him forget about snow and winter and everything except her. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "But we do it our way. No big ceremony, no approval seeking from the town, just us and whoever we actually care about. Deal." They married 2 weeks later, with Sheriff Brennan officiating in a brief ceremony at the cabin. The witnesses were Henry Morrison, Sarah Mae Carson, and a handful of other allies they'd accumulated. Mrs. Hendricks was notably absent, as were most of the town's so-called respectable citizens. But Clara and Elias didn't care. They spoke their vows in the golden light of a December afternoon, promising partnership and love and the strength to face whatever the frontier threw at them. And when Brennan pronounced them married, the kiss they shared tasted like triumph and belonging and home. The celebration was simple, a meal shared with their small group of supporters, stories and laughter that filled the cabin with warmth. As evening fell and their guests departed, Clara and Elias stood on the porch watching the last wagon disappear. "Mrs. Rourke," Elias said, testing the name, "how does it feel?" "Like the end of running, like the beginning of everything else." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, both of them looking out at the land they'd claimed. "We did it, Elias. We actually did it. Built a life worth living. More than that, we proved that broken doesn't mean finished, that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." They stood there as darkness fell and stars emerged, two people who'd survived their separate hells and found each other in the aftermath. The frontier stretched around them, still brutal, still unforgiving, still ready to test them at every turn. But they'd learned something important. Survival wasn't about being strong enough to face the world alone. It was about being brave enough to let someone stand beside you, to build something together that could weather any storm. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the desert night settled into its familiar rhythms. And between those two certainties, Clara and Elias had carved out something rare and precious. A partnership forged in adversity, a love built on mutual respect and shared strength, a life that was wholly and completely theirs. The Arizona Territory had tried to break them both. Instead, it had broken them open, made space for something new to grow. And what grew was stronger than either of them alone, resilient as the desert itself, enduring as stone. They'd come to the frontier seeking escape, from grief, from expectations, from pasts too painful to carry. What they found instead was purpose, each other, home. And as they turned to go inside to the warmth and the life they'd built together, Clara paused on the threshold. "No regrets?" she asked. Elias looked at her, his wife, his partner, his reason for believing that second chances were real. Not a single one. They crossed into the cabin together, closing the door against the night. And in the morning, they'd wake to face whatever challenges came next. But tonight, they simply existed in the space they'd created. Two souls who'd found their way through darkness to something like peace. The frontier would always be harsh. Life would always be hard. But together, they'd proven they could survive anything. More than survive. They could thrive. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.